You know, when was the last time you sat in an empty theater? Not just sat there, but really felt the weight of all those empty seats staring back at you. Reminds me of something I've been thinking about lately. Let me tell you something about dreams and determination. Picture this: New York City, 1993. A young actor standing on stage in some run-down theater, pouring his heart out to an audience you could count on one hand. Kind of like life itself. Sometimes your biggest moments happen when nobody's watching. You see, I've been thinking about this fella, Pedro Pascal. Not the one you know from The Mandalorian or The Last of Us. No, I'm talking about the kid who used to go by Pedro Balmaceda, back when he was living on hope and instant noodles, bouncing between auditions and waiting tables. Welcome to Rise Stoically, where we don't deal in quick fixes or empty promises. What we're exploring here runs deeper than that. Wisdom that's weathered centuries, tested by time and tragedy alike. Pull up a chair, friend. Let's talk about what really matters. Now here's where it gets interesting. We're gonna take this journey together, looking at some ancient wisdom through the lens of a modern story. Not because Pascal consciously followed any ancient philosophy, mind you, but because his path, well, it speaks to something timeless, something true. And you know what? By the time we're done here, you might just see your own struggles a little differently. Maybe find that quiet strength inside you that's been there all along. Principle 1. Dancing with uncertainty. Ever noticed how life has this way of laughing at your plans? Take 1973 Santiago, Chile. A family's gathered around their dinner table, feeling pretty secure about their future. They don't know it yet, but in a matter of months they'll be leaving everything behind. That's the thing about certainty. It's usually just an illusion. That family was the Pascals. Pedro was just a baby when they fled to Denmark, then to Texas. Imagine that. Your whole world packed into whatever suitcases you can carry. The ancient Stoics had a word for this kind of situation: appropriatum, the unexpected. They didn't see it as something to fear, but as life's way of teaching us to dance. Fast forward to 2013. Picture a worn-out apartment in Los Angeles. Our friend Pedro's staring at his phone, trying to figure out how to film an audition for some show about dragons and kingdoms. Bank accounts running on fumes, rents coming due. Might be his last shot before heading back to New York. You know what he did? Shot that Game of Thrones audition anyway. Bad lighting and all. The Stoics would have appreciated that moment. See, they understood something most folks forget. Uncertainty isn't your enemy. It's your teacher. Like that old saying goes, the only constant in life is change. But here's where it gets interesting. When Pascal walked into that Game of Thrones audition room, he wasn't just hoping for a part. He was carrying 20 years of unexpected turns, theater gigs that paid in experience instead of cash, TV spots that came and went like summer rain, nights wondering if he'd made the right choice leaving NYU. Each uncertainty had shaped him, taught him something about staying steady when the ground starts shaking. That's what we're really talking about here. Not just dealing with uncertainty, but learning to find your footing in it. When's the last time you felt that ground shift under your feet? Maybe it was a job that didn't pan out, a relationship that took an unexpected turn, or a dream that needed rerouting. The real art isn't in avoiding these moments. It's in what the Stoics called the reserve clause, doing your absolute best while accepting that the outcome isn't in your hands. Just like young Pascal shooting that audition on an iPhone, sometimes all you can do is give it your all and let the chips fall where they may. And you know what? That's okay. Because uncertainty, well, it's got this way of pushing you toward who you're meant to become. Principle 2, the art of control. There's this old story about a rancher I knew spent his whole life trying to predict the weather. Had every gadget you could imagine, barometers, wind vanes, fancy forecast equipment, still couldn't stop the rain from falling when it chose to. Reminds me of something the ancient Stoics figured out long ago. The secret isn't in controlling the storm, but in mastering your own sails. Back in the early 90s, a teenage Pedro Pascal learned this lesson the hard way at New York University. Theater department, Tisch School of the Arts. Prestigious program, sure, but something wasn't clicking. See, the school had its way of doing things, its formula for what makes an actor. Pascal had a choice to make. Most folks would have played it safe, followed the blueprint. Instead, he did something that probably gave his parents sleepless nights, walked away from that degree just shy of graduation. Not because he was giving up on acting, mind you, because he knew the only thing he could truly control was his approach to the craft. The Shakespeare Theatre in Washington, D.C. became his real classroom. Worked as an usher, watching every show he could, studying how the great actors moved, spoke, lived in their character's skin. No guaranteed outcome, no fancy diploma at the end. Just pure dedication to the elements he could control, his preparation, his observation, his growth. Now, this next part. This is where it gets real interesting. After years of small parts, a doctor here, a murder suspect there, Pascal landed this role in Game of Thrones. 7 episodes. Might have seemed like a small thing, but he controlled what mattered. Every gesture, every line, every moment he was given, and he turned Oberyn Martell into someone unforgettable. The Stoics had a term for this, dichotomy of control. Fancy words for a simple truth. Some things are up to us, most things aren't. Your effort, that's yours. The outcome, that belongs to the universe. Just ask any actor who's ever walked into an audition room. You can nail every line, hit every mark, and still not get the part. But here's what most folks miss. Real power isn't in trying to control everything. It's in pouring yourself completely into what you can control. When Pascal took on the Mandalorian, he couldn't control how folks would react to a hero whose face they never see. But he could control how he used his voice, his body language, to tell that story. That's the kind of control that actually matters. And you know something? Life's got a way of honoring that kind of focus. Not always in the way you expect, mind you, but when you stop wrestling with what you can't control and start mastering what you can, well, that's when things get mighty interesting. Principle 3, the strength in struggle, Santiago, 1976. A mother wraps her 3-year-old son in a blanket, hurrying through darkened streets. Behind them, a home they can't return to. Ahead, a future they can't see. Sometimes the hardest moments in our lives become our greatest teachers. That little boy was Pedro Pascal, and that night was just the beginning of a long journey through adversity. Denmark came first. Imagine trying to find your footing in a country where you don't speak the language, where everything from the food to the sky feels foreign. Then Texas, where young Pedro had to learn yet another way of being, another language, another life. The Stoics had this fascinating idea about difficulty. They saw it like a blacksmith sees fire, not as something destructive, but as the very thing that makes the metal stronger. Makes me think of how Pascal carried his mother's name into his acting career years after losing her. Turned that deep wound into something meaningful. Here's a part of the story most folks don't know about. In those early New York days, Pascal was so broke he'd sometimes have to sneak onto the subway just to get to auditions, living on a diet of rice and beans, sharing a cramped apartment with too many roommates. But instead of bitter, it made him resourceful. Each setback was like another rep in life's gymnasium, building strength he didn't even know he needed. 14. Rolls around, Game of Thrones makes him a recognized face. But fame has its own kind of trials. Suddenly everyone's got an opinion about you, expecting things from you. Some might have gotten lost in that spotlight. Instead, Pascal did something remarkable. Took on Narcos right after, a role that required him to dig deep into his Latin American roots, to face the kinds of stories that hit close to home. The ancient Stoics would have appreciated his response to the Mandalorian challenge. Most actors would have balked at wearing a helmet that covers their face, especially right when their career was soaring. But Pascal saw it differently, turned that limitation into an opportunity to master a whole new way of storytelling. And that's the thing about adversity. It's not about how hard you get hit, it's about how you transform those hits into something useful. Like taking the weight of expectations from The Last of Us, stepping into a character that millions of gamers already had in their hearts, and using that pressure to fuel something authentic and new. Sometimes I think about that little boy wrapped in a blanket, running through Santiago's streets. He couldn't have known then that each challenge was shaping him, preparing him. That's the mystery of struggle. You never know how today's hardship might be forging tomorrow's strength. Principle 4. Walking with humility. The tallest trees in a forest, they say, are often the first to catch the lightning. Been thinking about that lately, watching how success has a way of testing a person's character more than failure ever could. Reminds me of something I witnessed at the Shakespeare Theatre years ago. Picture this: a successful TV actor, fresh off a hit show, returns to perform in a small theatre production. No fancy trailer, no star treatment, just another member of the ensemble, sharing the same cramped dressing room, helping move sets between scenes. That was Pedro Pascal, right after his Game of Thrones breakthrough. The Stoics wrote about something they called the Great Leveler. This idea that no matter how high you climb, the ground beneath your feet stays the same. Pascal learned this lesson early, watching his parents rebuild their lives from scratch. A respected doctor and a child psychologist in Chile, reduced to starting over in a new land. That kind of experience has a way of teaching you what really matters. Something happened in 2019 that tells you everything you need to know about the man. The Mandalorian had just made him one of the biggest stars on television. But instead of chasing more high-profile roles, he took a small part in a theatre production of King Lear. When asked why, he said something that would have made those old Stoic philosophers smile. Talked about how theatre keeps you honest, reminds you that you're just one part of a larger story. And speaking of stories, ask anyone who's worked with Pascal on set, from his early Law & Order days to The Last of Us. They'll tell you about a fella who still brings coffee to the crew, who learns every stagehand's name, who treats the person sweeping the floor with the same respect as the director. That's not something you can fake. It's the kind of humility that comes from remembering your own journey. The thing about real humility, it's not about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less. When Pascal hosts Saturday Night Live, he's the first one to make fun of his own internet fame. When he's interviewed about The Mandalorian, he spends more time praising the puppeteers and stunt team than talking about himself. Here's what most folks miss about staying grounded. True humility isn't just about how you handle success. It's about how you treat people when nobody's watching. Like how Pascal still keeps in touch with his theatre friends from the struggling days, or how he uses his platform to spotlight causes he believes in without making it about himself. The Stoics believed that fortune's wheel never stops turning. Top of the world today, starting over tomorrow. The trick isn't in avoiding the turns, but in staying steady through them. Maybe that's why Pascal seems so comfortable in his own skin these days. He knows both the highs and lows are just temporary stops on a longer journey. Principle 5, purpose beyond fame. In the old days of Hollywood, they used to say an actor's worth was measured by the size of their name on the marquee. Always found that kind of thinking a bit backwards, like judging a book by its cover or a horse by its saddle. Real value, well, that runs deeper than any billboard can show. Take a cold morning in New York, somewhere around 2000. A young actor's teaching theater to kids in Washington Heights, making barely enough to cover his subway fare. That was Pascal, long before fame came calling. Not chasing spotlights, just sharing something he believed in. Those old Stoics would have understood. They knew true purpose isn't about recognition, it's about contribution. Something shifted in Pascal's career after Narcos. He had options then. Could have chased the same type of roles, built himself a comfortable niche. Instead, he chose The Mandalorian, a part where nobody would see his face. When folks asked him why, his answer cut straight to the heart of things. It's about the story we're telling, not the face telling it. The Stoics had this notion about true north, this idea that you've got to find your own measure of what matters. Makes me think of 2023, when Pascal took on The Last of Us. Sure, it was a big-budget HBO show, but at its core, it was about something universal. The lengths we'll go to protect the ones we love. He wasn't just playing a part. He was exploring what it means to be human. Here's a detail most folks don't know. During the pandemic, when most celebrities were posting from their mansions, Pascal was quietly supporting theater workers who'd lost their income. No press releases, no social media campaign. Just someone remembering where they came from and trying to make a difference. And that brings us to something interesting about purpose. It's not always about the grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the small choices, like how Pascal still does theater workshops when his schedule allows, or how he uses his platform to shine a light on stories that might otherwise go untold. The Stoics would call this living in accordance with nature. Being true to your deeper values, not just your ambitions. There's this moment in an interview where someone asked Pascal about his overnight success. He just laughed, talked about those 20 years of showing up, of doing the work, of believing in the craft even when nobody was watching. That's what purpose looks like. Not just doing something for the results, but because it matters to your soul. You see, Hollywood's got this way of turning people into products. But real purpose, that's about remembering you're human first, actor second. It's about understanding that your work, whatever it might be, is part of a larger conversation with the world. Principle 6. Dancing with change. Ever watched how a river flows? It doesn't fight the rocks in its path, flows around them, over them, sometimes even under them. Nature's got this way of teaching us about change, if we're willing to pay attention. There's this moment in Pascal's story that not many folks know about. Back in 1993, he'd just finished filming his first real TV gig, a guest spot on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Should have been his big break. Except the whole thing ended up on the cutting room floor. Now, that kind of setback could make some folks bitter. Instead, it taught him something those ancient Stoics knew well. Everything changes. Nothing's guaranteed. Been thinking about how Pascal's whole life has been a lesson in adaptation. Born in Chile, childhood in Denmark, grew up in Texas, found his footing in New York. Each move meant learning new languages, new customs, new ways of being. That's the kind of experience that teaches you to hold things lightly, to see change not as an enemy, but as a dance partner. The Stoics had this practice they called premeditation of adversity, imagining changes before they happen, not out of fear but readiness. Reminds me of how Pascal approached the Mandalorian. Most actors would have seen that helmet as a prison. He saw it as an invitation to reinvent his craft, to find new ways of storytelling through movement and voice. Something interesting happened during Game of Thrones. Pascal's character Oberyn Martell became an instant fan favorite. But instead of trying to hold on to that moment, to replicate that success, he let it go. Moved on to Narcos, completely different role, different energy, different world. That's someone who understands that growth comes from embracing change, not fighting it. In The Last of Us, there's this scene where Pascal's character has to adapt to being a surrogate father. It's fiction, sure, but it echoes something true about life. How sometimes the roles we never expected become the ones that define us. The Stoics would have appreciated that kind of openness to life's surprises. Here's what most folks miss about dealing with change. It's not about being unmoved by it like some stone in a stream. It's about being like that river we talked about, fluid, responsive, always finding a way forward. When Pascal started out, he probably never imagined he'd become famous for playing a character whose face you never see, or for bringing a video game character to life. But that's the beauty of staying open to life's currents. The business of storytelling, like life itself, is always in flux. Streaming services change the game. New technologies emerge. Audience tastes shift like desert sands. The trick isn't in trying to control all that change. It's in learning to move with it, to find your balance in the middle of the dance. Principle 7. True courage. There's a moment before every storm when everything goes quiet. Birds stop singing. Wind holds its breath. World seems to pause. That's when you find out what you're really made of, not when the storm hits, but in that moment of anticipation. Winter, 2013, Los Angeles. Pascal's sitting in his apartment, staring at a phone with dying battery, about to film what might be his last audition before throwing in the towel. Bank accounts empty, hopes running thin. Those moments, that's where real courage lives, not in the absence of fear, but in its company. The Stoics had this interesting take on courage. They saw it not as some grand gesture, but as a daily practice. Makes me think of Pascal's early days at Labyrinth Theatre Company. Every night, stepping onto that small stage, performing experimental plays for audiences sometimes smaller than a family dinner. No guarantee it would lead anywhere, just the courage to keep showing up. Here's something that'll make you think. When Pascal got the role in Wonder Woman 1984, he faced a different kind of challenge. Had to learn to fly on wires, perform complex stunts, all while fighting vertigo. Most folks would have used a double for everything. Instead, he spent months working through that fear, turning it into something useful. The interesting thing about fear, it's got a way of pointing directly at what matters most to us. Take The Last of Us. Stepping into a character that millions of gamers already loved, that's the kind of pressure that could paralyze you. But true courage isn't about being fearless, it's about finding purpose bigger than your fear. Remember that kid who fled Chile? Sometimes I wonder if that early experience, carrying fear as a constant companion while his family sought safety, taught Pascal something profound about courage. It's not about waiting for the fear to pass. It's about learning to walk with it. There's this scene in The Mandalorian where his character has to step into a fight he might not win. Kind of mirrors Pascal's own journey. Every audition, every new role, every time he had to reinvent himself. The Stoics would have recognized that kind of courage, clear-eyed, purposeful, without bravado or foolishness. And that brings us to something worth pondering. What if courage isn't about being unafraid? What if it's about finding that quiet center inside yourself, that place where your purpose burns brighter than your fears? Because here's the truth. Every worthwhile journey starts with that moment of choosing to move forward, even when your knees are shaking. Principle 8. The wisdom of reflection. You ever notice how the deepest lakes are also the quietest? Surface might ripple now and then, but down deep there's this stillness where everything becomes clear. That's what wisdom feels like. Not the noise of knowing things, but the quiet of understanding them. 20 years before The Last of Us made him a household name, Pascal was doing something that would shape everything that followed. Between auditions and waiting tables, he'd slip into the back of Broadway theaters, watching, learning, reflecting. Not just seeing the performances, mind you, but really studying how the great ones built their craft. The Stoics had this practice. End of each day, they'd take time to reflect. Not just thinking about what happened, but understanding why it mattered. Reminds me of something Pascal shared in an interview after Narcos. Talked about how playing Javier Peña made him reflect on his own childhood in Latin America. How sometimes you have to revisit your past to understand your present. There's this moment in The Mandalorian that speaks volumes. His character has to make a choice between following orders and following his conscience. Pascal drew from somewhere deep for that performance. Years of watching his parents choose their values over safety in Chile, his own journey of choosing art over security. That's what reflection does, turns experience into wisdom. Speaking of wisdom earned the hard way, when Pascal lost his mother, he could have let that grief define him. Instead, he reflected on her legacy, how she'd taught him to find beauty in stories, to use art as a way of understanding life. Kept her name professionally, not just as a tribute, but as a reminder of what really matters. The interesting thing about real growth, it doesn't happen in the doing, but in the understanding. After Game of Thrones brought sudden fame, Pascal did something remarkable. Stepped back, took supporting roles, returned to theater. Not running from success, but making sure he understood what kind of artist, what kind of person he wanted to be. Here's what most folks miss about wisdom. It's not about collecting experiences like souvenirs. It's about letting those experiences change how you see the world. When Pascal took on The Last of Us, he wasn't just playing another role. He was bringing every lesson, every reflection, every understanding he'd gathered along the way. The Stoics believed that wisdom wasn't in what happened to you, but in how you learned from it. Like that old saying about how experience is what you get right after you needed it. The trick is in taking time to understand what life's trying to teach you. And you know what? Maybe that's the real gift of looking back. Not just seeing where you've been, but understanding how it shaped who you're becoming. Because in the end, every step on your path, every triumph, every setback, they're all just pages in the story you're learning to tell. You know, as the sun sets on this story, I can't help but think about that little boy from Chile. The one who became the man we know today. Not because the path was easy, but because he learned to walk it with grace. We've covered some ground together, haven't we? Talked about dancing with uncertainty, like Pascal did all those years in New York's experimental theaters, explored how to focus on what's in your control, even when life seems to be writing its own script, saw how adversity, like those early days of struggle and sacrifice, can forge something remarkable in a person's spirit. The Stoics understood something profound about life. It's not about the cards you're dealt, but how you play them. Through Pascal's journey, we've seen what that looks like in the real world. From teaching theater to kids in Washington Heights, to becoming the internet's favorite dad, every chapter of his story carries echoes of those ancient truths. But here's something worth holding on to. This isn't just about one actor's path to success. It's about understanding that every one of us is walking our own road. Maybe you're facing uncertainty right now, standing at a crossroads that feels too heavy with consequence. Or perhaps you're riding high, trying to keep your feet on the ground while fortune smiles your way. Whatever chapter you're living, remember, those old Stoics weren't just philosophers. They were people, like you and me, trying to find their way through life's storms with dignity and purpose. And Pascal, he's not just a star on a screen, he's a reminder that sometimes the longest roads lead to the most meaningful destinations. The wisdom we've explored together, about staying humble in success, finding purpose beyond appearances, embracing change, showing courage in the face of fear, and learning from every step. It's all there for the taking, not as rules carved in stone, but as guideposts for your own journey. As our trails part here, take with you what resonates. Maybe it's the courage to face uncertainty, the wisdom to focus on what matters, or the understanding that every challenge carries a gift in its hands. Your story's still being written, just like Pascal's, just like all of ours. And remember, the same strength that carried a young boy from Chile to Denmark to Texas to New York to Hollywood, that same strength lives in you. It's just waiting for its moment to shine. Until next time, keep walking your path with grace. After all, the best chapters of your story might just be the ones you haven't written yet.